Hi everyone! Welcome back to the TechMaki channel. Today we're going to continue on the creation of our RavenDB repository. We are going to create the context and also allow the menu service to access the RavenDB. If you haven't yet subscribed, please click on the subscribe button and also click on the notification bell in order to receive information as soon as I publish new videos. And if you have already done that, please help me spread this content by sharing this with your friends and colleagues, okay? Alright, so let's go! Okay, so in order to create the client that will access the RavenDB and basically create the database, we need to install a NuGet package in our .NET solution. So let's do it. In order to do this, I need to navigate to the project, to the TMaki menu project. So I'm going to go TMaki menu. Okay, now I'm in the TMaki menu. And here I'm going to do .NET add package, and then the name of the package, which is RavenDB.client, and the version. The latest version is 5.0.3. I'm going to hit enter, and this is going to install the RavenDB client in our solution. What it does really is just going here in the CSProj and adding that reference here, RavenDB, pointing to the version 5.0.3. So then we're going to create the context file, right? So let's create a new class here in the TMaki, and this is going to be RavenDB context. This RavenDB context class will actually contain all the logic for starting the database, actually creating the database in case there is no database available. Let's see how it works. Okay, so I'm going to actually rename this as iRavenDB context.cs. This is going to be our interface. So public interface iRavenDB context. Okay, and inside of this, we're going to contain the most important object that we need to have for connecting with RavenDB, which is the document store, the public iDocument store. And basically it's going to be store, and here I will need to import some references of RavenDB. So using raven.client.documents. After we define the interface, we are going to create the RavenDB context public class, RavenDB context, and the RavenDB context is going to inherit from iRavenDB context. That's fine. So by inheriting from iRavenDB, we need to implement the interface, so the document store is going to be here. Okay, so now let's define the settings of RavenDB. So the basic settings that it needs, the URL and like the name of the database, so all the basic information it needs to establish the context. I'm going to put this in the app settings, and I'm going to create a section here called database. And inside of this database section, we're going to have some information that are important. The first one is basically the name of the database that we are going to create. In this case, it's going to be menu. Well, let's put database. And then we're going to define the URL where the database is actually running. So the URL of the database is going to be an array instead of one single item, because the database can be running in multiple nodes. And then we might have, for example, if we don't have access to a certain URL because somehow it's failing, we can access another node that is being synchronized constantly. So that's the good thing also about RavenDB. RavenDB has, by default, you can define some rules of synchronization of data between the multiple nodes, not only two nodes, multiple nodes. And then in case one node is in failure or like it's down, you can access the other instance and continue to do all your operations on the other instance. Okay. So I'm going to define here. Okay. So I save this. This is the database section. And we need to parse this and bring this to a C# class. And how we're going to do this? There are multiple ways of doing this, but that's actually a very good way that I found in how to expose in a very simple code and in a very clean way. So let's do that. And I'm going to go to the startup.
In the startup, I'm going to do the following. I'm going to type services.add configure, right? Yeah. And we're going to configure what does it mean, right? It means that this configure does a very interesting thing in a very clean manner. It actually injects an object that contains the configuration that was parsed from the app settings to a class that is actually a model that contains the exact same structure of the app settings. So we can define a C# class that will contain the exact same properties that we define in the app settings. This is going to be defined and parsed to this C# instance, and this C# instance is going to be injected and made available for all the other services that wants to consume that. So that's actually very clean and very good way to define our configurations and settings. So let's do this. Let's create the persistence settings. And here I'm going to define that using the configuration object, configuration.getSection, and I'm going to specify here the the database section, right? Which is the one that we defined it on the app settings. So this is the database section. We are going to specify here in the configuration.getSection database. And this persistent settings was not created yet. So let's create this C# class. I'm going to create down here. So public class persistent settings. And this needs to have exactly the same number and names of the parameters that are defined in the section in the app settings. So this is going to be, the first is going to be the database name, right? Database name. And the second one is going to be the URL. And the URL is actually an array of strings. So it's an array of strings called URL. Cool. So then we have the persistent settings, and this is going to be injected with the parsed parameters from the app settings in any service class that we, any class from the .NET Core application that we want to use this value, right? This information. Okay. So let's just go now to the RavenDB context and use this information there. Okay, so I'm going to go to the RavenDB context, and inside of the RavenDB context, I'm going to define the constructor, so ctor, and for some reason it didn't get the right name, so RavenDB context, and what is going to come here is going to be iOption monitor. This is the interface that actually is the one used for the in the catalog, right? For these objects that are set via the config. If you use the services.configure, this is how you're going to be able to retrieve that in the constructor of other classes. So I'm going to use the iOptions monitor, and then I'm going to define here that I want to get from this structure, I want to look at the persistent settings. And then I'm going to name this variable as settings. And that's how very easily I have access to settings.database. Actually, I need to get the current value first. So let's just call it settings, and then I'm going to name it persistence settings. And here I'm going to get the current value. And then in the persistent settings, I have access to the database name and to the URLs. So now let's go ahead and create a new store. So this is going to be, I'm going to create like a simple variable here, which is the local store, just temporarily, new document store. What are the settings that it needs to receive, right? It needs to receive exactly the ones that we defined in the app settings. So it needs to receive database. Then I'm going to specify settings dot, persistent settings dot database name, and the URL is going to be the persistent settings.url. So let's just make a small change here. I'm going to change this to URLs because it makes a lot more sense. And I'm also going to change here in the persistence class to URLs. And then I'm at the end going to change this in the persistent settings over here. Okay, so this is the database, basically the default database name, and the URL where this service is going to be available. So, okay, so now let's continue to use RavenDB and test our solution. Okay, so now let's do local store dot initialize. So then it's going to initialize the database for us. And basically, in order to set that to the store here, let's do the following. Let's expose this local store as a private field, right? So it's a private read-only and local store. Put it here and return it as the information that we are looking for. It needs to be a iDocument store. All right, so it's at the iDocument store. It's going to return here in the get of the document store. Let's just move it up a little bit so we do now have it together here. It's easier to identify. All right, so it says that it doesn't implement the set, so I don't need the set actually. So let's remove the set from here, and that's fine. Okay, so now we have the initialization of this RavenDB context. But what's going to happen is that if we do this way, it's going to start and try to access the database, and it's going to fail. So how do we overcome that? How do we create here via code this database when this database does not exist? So we need to find a way to, in case the database does not exist, it's going to be created automatically for us. So the way that we're going to do this is by calling a new method that I'm going to implement here called public void ensure database is created. So let's do it. It's going to receive the local stores, and then this is going to check that RavenDB, if not created, it is going to create automatically for us. So for our first operation here, we're going to have to wrap it in a try catch because it may fail, right? And if it fails, it means that we're going to create the database. So let's put an exception here, and let's define inside of this try catch block. Let's define the following. Oh, I think we are missing a reference here to the system. That's fine. And here we're going to do local store, that is maintenance. For the maintenance, we're going to get some information about statistics. That's the simplest information that we can get. So it means that if it fails, we are going to have to create this database for us. So for database, name it. And then we need to get the name of the database from the settings, right? So let's just store the settings over here. So private, read-only, persistence settings, persistence settings over here. And then we're going to use it over here. So for database, persistence settings dot database name, let's do the following. Let's send an information to get some statistics. We need to use the raven.client.documents.operations. So this is like very basic operational information that we're going to get from the database. And this operation is new get statistics operation. So we just get like basic information of if the database is running, not running, if it's healthy or not, right? So it's very simple information and it's very light. So this is the one that we use to ensure if the database is created or not. It's just a simple call. And if that works fine, we can get information of statistics from the database, which is good. We can store somewhere. And if it doesn't, then it means that we need to create that database. All right, so in order to create our database, we are going to have to use raven.client.server-wide.operations, actually commands, and also use raven client server-wide operations. All right, so then here we're going to call local storage.maintenance, and so we are entering the maintenance area, and in the maintenance area we are going to call the server maintenance features. The server maintenance features, we are going to send a command to the server, and this command to the server is going to be new create database operation. This create database operation is what is going to actually create the database for us, right? We need to initialize a new database record. And this new database record, let's just use RavenDB client server-wide. So let's put it over here using Raven client server-wide in general. Let's remove the comments we are not using for anything. And then it's going to be new database record. The parameter of this new database record is the database name. So let's use the underscore persistent settings dot database name. So this is what is going to create the database for us. And I think that's all we need for now. There is a very specific exception that happens in case the get statistics operation tries to access the database and then this database does not exist. So RavenDB has this specific exception for us. So then it makes more sense to, instead of using a generic exception, to use this specific one. So database does not exist exception, something like this. Let's see if we have that specific or if it is, yes, exactly. So database does not exist exception using raven.client.exceptions.database. So then it means that every time the database does not exist, it is going to come here and create the database for us, a database named menu in this case. As the last step, let's go to the startup.cs. And here, let's add an instance of services.add singleton. And let's add a singleton of RavenDB context. It's going to actually inject RavenDB context, concrete instance. Then that's it. And it's going to actually start the RavenDB as soon as we start the application. In order to test that, let's go ahead in the RavenDB context and put a breakpoint over here. All right, so now let's go to the weather forecast controller and let's actually extract the product controller from here to its own class. So I'm going to extract and move the type to product controller.cs. Inside of this class, let's actually inject that on the constructor. So let's create a constructor here. And here I'm going to inject the RavenDB context. So let's call it context. And then I'm going to specify a context variable that is going to receive the context here. So a property, a private field, private read only, and it's called underscore context. And that's pretty much RavenDB context. Oh, so right on time, I actually realized that two things here that I need to fix. First is that, right? So in the persistent settings, I'm getting the values, but I'm setting to a variable here. I should set that to the field that I have just created. So then here we are going to use the field, and this is going to be also the same one available here for the when we are actually ensuring that the database is created. And the second thing is that we need to make sure that we call this ensure database is created from the constructor. The variable here, we are declaring a variable, but we are also using as a field over there. So let's just remove this var. And also let's call this as a document store instead of a iDocument store. Another thing to take into consideration is that when we're going to debug, right? And actually to debug, avoid putting a breakpoint here in the line 38 because basically this, for some reason, it's actually generating a threading exception. Let's put a breakpoint just in the line number 41 and let's test, okay? So I'll hit F5 just to see it working for real. So what's going to happen is that as soon as we try to trigger the product controller and try to trigger any API on the product controller, it's going to start the RavenDB context. When it tries to start the RavenDB context, we're going to hit that breakpoint over there. Let's now try it out, click in execute, and then wait for that. Yes, so what happened is that the database does not exist, it triggered the exception, and now let's just play because it's going to create the database for us. Let's just go back here and just check and make sure that we have no database created at the moment. As soon as we hit this line and we play, this is going to create the database automatically for us. Let's see it doing it right now. Cool. So now let's go back and we have the menu database created. All right, so there were tons of work today, right? Today we created the RavenDB context. First, we downloaded the RavenDB image from Docker and we made it available as a container for us. Then after that, we created the RavenDB context inside of our menu backend. And then in case we didn't have the menu database available, we created the database automatically for us. In the next video, we're going to continue on the creation of the repository, where we are going to allow actions on top of the database in a very generic way. Don't forget to subscribe and also to hit on the notification button in order to receive notifications when we publish new videos. I hope to see you soon on the next video.